So, hello, Pete, and welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to having this conversation today because although the conversations often descend into political talk on this show, the groups we discuss aren't necessarily directly linked with politics and government. But today's conversation might be a bit different in that way. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Hi, Casey. It was nice to meet you. My name is Pete Smith. I was raised in South Bend, Indiana, in the United States, and I grew up in a cult called the People of Praise.
Anybody that is unaware of the People of Praise, is there a summary of the history of the group, where it came from, and how it changed over time that you can give myself and the listeners?
Sure. The best place to start would be something called Vatican II, which happened in the Catholic Church when the Pope kind of changed the rules of the service. Um, Basically, if you could imagine attending a religious service and having a group of priests lead it, but they don't speak your language and they often don't even look at you. What happens over generations is that people tend to view that service as more of like a family tradition than a genuine religious experience or a way that they interact with the deity. So in Vatican II, the Pope said basically that, now instead of having all of our services in Latin, we're going to have them in the language of the people who attend. And we're not going to, have this strict Gregorian chanting, but there might even be guitar. And we're also going to allow something called lay ministry, which means that people who are not ordained priests are also allowed to carry out the work of the church, whether that's through trying to help people in poverty or any other ministry that they might determine would be a good use of their time. Allowing lay ministry opens the door for people to envision a new way in which they can experience their religion. So people who had this tradition of only just I'm Catholic because my parents were Catholic, because my parents were Catholic, because everyone in Ireland is Catholic, now can say, well, I'm going to manifest my um, religion in a new set of ways. Um, and as people were thinking about this, two professors um, started trying to receive something called the gifts of the Holy Spirit that they'd heard about in other forms of Christianity. Their names were Ralph Kiefer and Bill Story. They were professors at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh in the United States. They felt like they had kind of reached a breakthrough, and they invited a bunch of students who were also interested in lay ministry to attend basically a weekend retreat. And there they prayed over people, and some of the people there actually claimed to receive the gifts of the Holy Spirit. What that means is that they believe that God blessed them personally, and that because of that blessing, they could now speak in tongues. Speaking in tongues would, for people who aren't aware, basically means that they can now speak a language which they previously had no knowledge of. This could be a real language or a made up language. In almost every case, though, it's just made up language. Um, the following weekend, Bill Story and Ralph Kiefer come to the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. South Bend is a Rust Belt city in the United States. It's kind of like the Midlands in the United Kingdom. There's not a lot of greats happening there. It's impoverished in a lot of ways because the work is kind of outdated or being moved to other countries, and so it's very easy to get people to latch on to something that offers salvation, right? So these two professors come to Notre Dame and they do the same thing. They pray over more people. This happens in 1967, and some of the people they prayed over at Notre Dame, which is a big center of Catholic intellectualism in the United States, would go on to also receive the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and they would go on to found what is the People of Praise. But that would happen 4 years later in 1971. It was founded by two men. Their names are Kevin Ranahan and Paul DeSelles. They were both educated at Notre Dame, and one taught at Notre Dame, taught physics, Paul DeSelles, and the other was a teacher at the adjacent Catholic women's college called St. Mary's. they formed a group of people not necessarily associated with Notre Dame, but mainly people who just lived in the city of South Bend and hadn't attended Notre Dame. And they started with 29 people, including themselves and their wives. And they kind of operated like that for about 4 years. For the first 4 years, their main focus was using something they had created called the Apostolic Institute, which was to create permanent deacons, which are kind of lay ministers within the Catholic Church. And that's where they made an important connection, which would be Amy Coney Barrett's father, who also became a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church, not in South Bend, but in New Orleans. So that they were participating in something called the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Renewal meaning we're going to renew the church. Charismatic not meaning influential or having a gravitational pull. That's an academic Catholic word that just refers to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And obviously this was very Catholic. Almost all the members in the very beginning were all Catholic and very Catholic oriented. Then in 1975, an adjacent covenant community to People of Praise was shut down and closed by the Catholic Church. And they kind of learned a lesson from that. They're like, we cannot be Catholic. We have to be ecumenical, because if we are Catholic, then we can be shut down by the church hierarchy. So with that knowledge in hand, they pursued ecumenical activity with a fervor. And they started having, there had always been national conventions for the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, but they started reaching out to Protestants and trying to form bonds across bridges that they didn't think they could cross together. And they adopted means that were already in use in a lot of Pentecostal churches, most notably the Assemblies of God. And then over time, this grew. And now most people would recognize the People of Praise because of its most famous member, Amy Coney Barrett, because she sits on the United States Supreme Court.
That was a really concise overview of the history of this group. So, I mean, it speaks to what you do for a living, but it also, I think, speaks to the amount of research that you must have done on the true history of the group before, after you left, because I imagine that when you're in the group, you are given one history, and when you leave, you realize that there's a slightly different one. So would you be able to tell the listeners what it is that you do for work?
Sure. I've worked as a professional journalist for 15 years after graduating from Indiana University with a degree in journalism. When Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court, I had a visceral reaction. I was like, I cannot believe this is happening. I cannot believe that they're going for this amount of power. Because to know the People of Praise to grow up in is to know that not everyone is welcome. They recruited people from Notre Dame's graduate school specifically because they wanted members who were going to assume positions of power. When I was growing up in South Bend, they had members in state government, city government. They were always trying to gain influence, and they were recruiting people who would take those positions, who already had wealth they could contribute to the People of Praise for their benefit. So it was shocking that they would try and make such a big power grab, because this is a very tiny group. When I was a kid, they probably had maybe 1,000 to 1,200 members in South Bend, and I don't think they ever were above 20,000 members worldwide. But it's not a massive religious movement. It was always very small and insular, and it was shocking. And I did what everyone else did who had survived it. Most People of Praise kids, we can call them second generation, I think, because your audience is educated enough in that terminology. They run from it like the plague when they become adults. They don't want to look back. They want to pretend it never happened. And even as kids, we didn't really talk about it amongst ourselves. There was always this assumption that we were in it, that we'd always been in it, and we always would be in it. But kids are forced to make a choice, which is when, you have to choose to be what they call underway, which is kind of a 2 to 5 year period where they indoctrinate you basically, and then make you sign a lifelong covenant to be a part of it. Most kids don't want any part of that, so they never go underway, and they don't make the covenant. They just leave, and that family relationship becomes strained. So all these second generation kids across the country reached out to each other on a one-on-one basis, but we started making connections. Because I grew up in South Bend, I didn't know People of Praise members in Minneapolis or Washington, D.C. or Portland, Oregon, or any of these cities. I lived in my little city and that was my group, but we found each other and we just started talking, and we realized that we had a ton in common, and that in me really spurred me to research the history of the People of Praise and understand what it was that I belonged to, because that assumption of we're just in this, we always will be, well, it hadn't played out, right? I was an adult now. I was 40 years old. I was no longer in the People of Praise. I hadn't talked to these people. I didn't want to talk to them. And I wanted to know what I was a part of. And what I found was it was beyond anything that I had recognized as a child. My childhood wasn't particularly great, and I felt like I suffered alone. It was very I don't know, just it reaffirmed my experience, I guess, to find other people um who who had been through the same things that I had.
Thank you for sharing that, Pete. It's a really incredible thing when survivors talk about finding other people when they really felt like there was nobody else in the world that could possibly understand what they'd experienced. And it's clear that this community that you have found has had a big impact on your life. So it's through these types of conversations that some of those connections are made, and who knows what can come from this conversation today in terms of people hearing your story and feeling the way you have felt in that validation from other people's experiences. So it's a really powerful thing when people are brave enough to come forward and share their experiences. So I appreciate you being here today to talk to us about this. In your email to me, you mentioned that your parents joined the People of Praise when they had moved to a new community and were seeking to become involved somehow or feel at home or find a place where they belonged, which is a common time in people's lives when we hear about individuals becoming wrapped up in destructive groups and groups that have hidden agendas and abusive practices. And I wondered if you would be willing to just talk us through what you recall about that time, and what you have learned, if you have learned anything from your parents in how they were approached by the People of Praise.
My parents were from the American South, which is very distinctively different than the Midwest, where I would be born and raised. Um, my father moved with my wife to South Bend to attend graduate school at Notre Dame. And it's a South Bend, like the Midlands, is very cold, isolating place. There's not a joyful atmosphere there. And so if you're from a warm place where everyone is very outgoing and welcoming, it's very difficult. Um, One of the things that People of Praise used to their advantage was that they had a prayer group on the campus of Notre Dame. It was had its meetings right above the main dining hall at Notre Dame, so that whenever you went to eat, you could hear this group singing very loudly and boisterously, and it would be like, hey, they didn't have to have like some weird cult messenger, have an awkward conversation, be like, hey, you want to come to the cult meeting? Like, you would just hear these people. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to play one of their
Oh,
main
yes,
songs.
please.
Most of their music, they keep it pretty close. They sing a bunch of songs that are only used within the charismatic renewal, and so the average person would never have an opportunity to really hear this kind of music. But it's very loud, and it draws you in and makes you curious. So it's very easy for a lot of strangers to just walk in and be like, hey, what's going on here? Everyone's involved. Everyone sings all at once. They're clapping. At the end of the song, they sing in rounds. Like, it's very animated and emotional. And
You were walking past, I think you'd be curious. You'd want to know what's going on in there. It's like street performers when there's a big crowd of people in the street where the shops are, and you're walking past and you're like, why is this big group crowded around? I'll go and join them and see what it is. I think I would definitely be curious to find out where all of those sounds are coming from, especially if it's live. It's different hearing something over the speakers. I imagine if you walked past and you could hear that it was actually people making that noise in the moment, I know I would be curious to see what that was like. Being told that there are intellectual aspects of the people of praise. Before we hit record, we had a discussion about those things. This seems like one of those things. It's a slightly different recruitment tactic, and I imagine it can be quite effective.
oh, they definitely use love bombing, when you are first showing interest. But at least at Notre Dame, this was the recruitment. It was, having their prayer meeting above the central dining hall and then using their music to draw people's interest. And when they started doing, when the people of praise started controlling that prayer meeting in 1975, that's how they started to grow pretty rapidly. Um, so my parents were involved in that. And they quickly, within 2 years, had made the covenant and had become full-fledged members of the people of praise. Eventually, my father would stop pursuing an academic career and join the people of praise's primary business, something called Charismatic Renewal Services. Um, Basically, that was at the time one of the largest Christian book distributors in the United States. Certainly, in the eastern half of the United States, it dominated. It would have been originally created to distribute like the print materials and all that kind of collateral you need to create this movement where all the diverse charismatic prayer groups throughout the country would start adopting the same practices and using unified teachings and unified materials. They would kind of try and create a unified presence, because all these charismatic prayer groups had sprung up in the late 60s across the country. There were, I think by 1973, about 1,200 of them, which basically is like every decently sized city in the United States. And so the leaders of this were really Kevin Ranahan and Paul DeSells, the two people of praise leaders, as well as Ralph Martin and Steve Clark, two people who ran a charismatic or covenant community in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And there was another person involved too, but he didn't make it. So by 1975, basically this group of four men had pushed, using CRS, which is kind of what we call it internally, to send, a unified message to all the prayer groups and encourage them to be covenant communities. And then from 75 to the mid 80s, people of praise in Ann Arbor began kind of absorbing all of these covenant communities across the country, to the point where there was no longer 1,200 prayer groups, but that people of praise controlled a large amount of covenant communities. Word of God in Ann Arbor became sort of the Spirit, kind of like as an umbrella agency, and controlled a large number there. And then maybe 10 to 15 other covenant communities kind of stayed on their own.
So it's like a giant vacuum cleaner that they've been able to pull in all of these things through this book distribution and printing business. That's quite impressive, really. It sounds like there was a lot of strategy and planning involved in terms of expanding under everyone's noses the operation that they had, and not explicitly saying, hey, we're here, we have all these places you can come and meet us. Would you say
Mhm.
that's kind of how it looks to have happened?
So I'm willing to allow that first generation members had genuine religious experiences. I'm willing to allow that, but that certainly wasn't my experience. And I think it's because of this other side of the movement, which was building the physical infrastructure, the buildings, the businesses, things that make these communities possible and enable them to do what they do. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we're a community, we're going to live this intense life. But everyone needs a building to have weddings or dinners or whatever, and so who's going to pay for the building, right? Who's going to maintain the building? And it very quickly grows into all these physical things that are needed. And so there's that adjacent side, right? There's the religious meetings that happen on a Sunday afternoon, but there's also the all-consuming part of building the infrastructure that kind of takes on more importance, frankly, in the leader's eyes, at least.
Is this an example of potential labor trafficking that takes place inside the People of Praise?
Not at the beginning. In the beginning, they were mainly trying to recruit people who would take positions of power, but those people had kids. And so they very quickly realized, we need to educate these kids, not just, at the parish school when they're in elementary school but also when they go into what's called a high school in America and in college as well. And we need to try and push them into positions of power as well, because eventually they kind of turn their focus from recruiting graduate students at universities across the country to raising their kids to do the same thing. And at that point, there were probably a 2 decade period where they hadn't really necessarily found the mojo to grow internally. I guess they had always just absorbed other groups, but in the mid '90s they realized that a lot of their kids were leaving and not coming back, just like I
Mm.
did, and so they kind of switched tactics. And Paul DeSales, who's he fills the role of chief missionary and kind of the brain trust of building the physical infrastructure stuff, he decides that we need to give kids a purpose. And so he declares to have this vision that the People of Praise needs to build 200 cities by the year 2045. And he starts training kids to become leaders to carry this out, and those child leaders would in turn bring in their friends to go on mission trips. And the purpose of the mission trips wasn't necessarily to evangelize. I mean, I guess that was part of it, but really it was to go into dilapidated neighborhoods, fix up houses, kind of take over a neighborhood, and then show people in that dilapidated neighborhood that good things will happen if you work with these people.
Right.
um, so it's a different variation on encouraging people to see their good works as opposed to hear their good music, right? But it's the same general idea. We're not going to have an awkward conversation like a bunch of traveling Mormons. We're going to show you something first to prove that we're for real, and then you're going to want to join us because you know how bad it was before we came to your neighborhood. And for that, they do traffic children across state lines, which is a crime in the United States. You can't traffic children across state lines and not pay them or not pay them, the minimum wage, which is exactly what People of Praise does. But they get away with it because no one in our country wants to investigate a religion. And I guess that brings us to the crux of the issue. Is People of Praise a religious group, or is it something else?
Yeah. Yeah. And I ask myself that question a lot in terms of religious groups that have known cases of human trafficking of various types, whether it's for sexual exploitation, labor trafficking, both, whether it's child labor trafficking or child trafficking or all of the above. And with the People of Praise and the second or multi-generational adults who are now finding each other in later life, now that people have been able to escape the group and find one another, it's things like human trafficking as opposed to coercion that may allow some type of legal action in the future. I know that there's a woman called Carol Murchison who I have interviewed on this show, who helps people take legal action against sexual harassment and misconduct inside religious and spiritual groups. And because of things like statute of limitations and because of things like coercion not being recognized as something illegal in the States, And even, in the UK, it's seen as a serious crime, but only in intimate partnerships and families. So even in a group setting, it's still not something that can be charged as a serious crime. But human trafficking is now what Carol and her team will look to be able to get those charges put onto people that have committed crimes that link to coercion and sexual abuse. So human trafficking as a recognized law across America, not just state to state, but as a country, is something that is becoming more and more recognized, I think, and that is very good news to people that want to take that legal action. And the timeline that you've given us in terms of the people of praise, where they came from, how they changed, and where they are today, where is it that you come into that particular timeline in the group's history?
So 2 years after my parents made the covenant, I was born in 1979. I wasn't in the first cohort of children who were born into the people of praise. I was probably what you call the second, but very early in their beginnings, and they hadn't fully understood. They didn't have a fully realized plan for how to get children from birth to making the covenant as an adult. And so I think that gives me a good perspective on what the people of praise is. Because that plan wasn't in place, I feel like they did a lot of experimenting on me and my friends. And I feel like, under Paul Lascelles' leadership, basically what the people of praise functioned like, from my perspective, was a giant experiment. What can we do to this kid to shape him or form him is what they would use. And how do we get him to grow into the person that we want him to be? And a lot of the indoctrination that happens occurs along an authoritarian chain of command. Basically, Paul Lascelles and Kevin Ranahan sit at the top. Lascelles, again, as the kind of the brain trust and physical infrastructure. Kevin Ranahan functions as kind of like the prophet.
Right.
One of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is prophecy, and basically his prophecy is the only stuff that the members listen to, at least in South Bend. And underneath them, they had a series of lieutenants. And then they would have, people involved in various organizations, like their education effort, or they had these things called brotherhood and sisterhood. Those were where people lived celibate lives. They called it being single for the Lord. But what we always assumed as kids was that those people were just gay in the brotherhood and sisterhood, and that they had been forced into a life of celibacy because they were not allowed to be their true self. I can't say that that's 100% true for all of them, but I would suspect that a significant number of them, if not 100%, would identify as LGBTQ given the chance. But
So
they
this
had all.
sorry, I just wanted to make a quick so you having this idea as a child that these two groups of people might be made up by individuals that identify as part of the LGBT community leads me to assume that from a young age you're taught that that's not something the church allows or encourages at all.
Okay, so just a quick point of clarification. The church is the Catholic Church. People of Praise has nothing whatsoever to do with the Catholic Church. I will allow that a majority of the members from 1971 to 75 were Catholic, but again, they adopted ecumenicism, and they very quickly became a cult. I mean, there's no other way to mince it. The first In the early days of the 70s, they had a lot of researchers and anthropologists studying this movement because it was a groundswell that happened in the United States and not necessarily around the world, at least for the Catholic Church. So a lot of priests were studying this academically. And one of the primary researchers from the very beginning was a guy named Fichter. And his first book is called The Catholic Cult of the Paraclete. Paraclete is academic Catholic for Holy Spirit. So the very first book identifies this as a cult. So let's not, I'm not going to mince words about this whatsoever. There is no doubt in the studies or history of this group that it's a cult. The only reason that people even debate this is because of a people of praise strategy that most journalists are susceptible to. In 1975, there was a 6-part investigation by the National Catholic Reporter newspaper in the United States, and it identified them and the Ann Arbor group as a cult. And at the end, the reporter likened its leaders to Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, he did this in print. This isn't, it's out there. Anyone can find it. If people ever want to email our group, we'd be happy to send it to them. We have a website, popsurvivors.com. But but uh, I feel like I've lost my train of thought
No,
a
no,
little bit.
we were
Um,
talking about I used the word church. I should have used the word group, but I was talking about the LGBT community within the church. Um, because as a child, you must have been taught some things to
yeah.
know that
So so within this hierarchy, there's Paul DeSales and Kevin Rand at the top. They're lieutenants, they're specialists. Then there's kind of city coordinators, is what they call them. And then there's like area coordinators. Then there's something called a head. A head supervises an individual member and then kind of reports information about that member up the chain of command. So they compile this huge database about people's most intimate details and lives and store that only the head leaders can see. That doesn't information doesn't flow in reverse. And then from the head, there's the individual member. If it's a man, he would supervise a wife. If it was a single woman, she would be supervised by another head called a handmaiden. And together, the husband and wife supervise their children. So children sit at the very bottom of this authoritarian chain of command. And if children are to receive a message like "Don't be gay, gay people are bad," whatever, it usually comes from the mother. So that's kind of how they receive their instruction. Um, and because of the intensity of that relationship, and there's no other word but intense. Parents didn't look at their children as like objects that they loved. In the vast majority of times, they looked at them as objects that they had to shape or control or a possession, even. And so they would tell you very early on, abortion is wrong. And they don't need to say it a billion times. They don't need to put it in writing. You don't need to hear it at the meeting. You just know because your parents told it to you in absolute terms. And you don't question anything your parents say unless you want a physical beating. Um, and so that's kind of like how young children in this group absorb, the idea that this was a bad thing. I personally don't know why I never absorbed that lesson. Um, I mean, I know that I was told that, and I know that it was reinforced throughout my childhood in different ways by people of praise adults, but it never stuck. It always seemed like ludicrous. Like, this whole idea that they push on you that God is this person who cares about you as an individual and wants to be involved in your individual life and made you to serve a purpose. Well, it doesn't take much. I mean, I think at the intellectual age of like 7, I could realize that if God made me this way, he also made gay people gay. Like it's not this, thing that requires an advanced set of knowledge. Like it's very simple to understand, and it was very simple to understand that the adults were lying to me. And so an experience of overwhelming hypocrisy on the part of adults is part of being a people of praise child. You learn to hear it, you learn to understand it, and you learn not to say anything. You just keep your mouth shut. um I think we were trying to talk about something larger though before. um could you refresh my memory about
Yeah, we were
original question?
talking about um where you came into that timeline and you were talking about how there was a lot of experimenting going on, and that's where the mention of the brotherhood and sisterhood came up. So I think you were just talking about the different elements that existed within the groups in terms of different kind of branches within the umbrella.
Hmm. And so my parents were Protestant, which has made us different. Um, and but that's all part of the experiment, right? Paul DeSalles doesn't care about whether you're Protestant or Catholic, because this isn't the church. This is a cult, and he's running an experiment. And what he wants to do is run mice through his maze and find out the results. So I'm just the Protestant mouse, and it's just more data, that he can gather. Um, so my parents also, my father worked for CRS, which is their primary business, so that also differentiated our family. We weren't just any member, we were also, a family that generated a lot of money for them. But that didn't necessarily put us in a position of power, because we were Protestant, because my parents were from the South, because my dad could come off as arrogant, um, which I could explain, but it isn't worth it for the point. Basically, it was very easy for him to be perceived as arrogant. So they would punish him in a form called servant leadership, where they force him to serve. And so it was a very common experience for me and my brother to, clean up the People of Praise's main building in South Bend. They owned a giant 9-story hotel in South Bend where they had most of their functions and where they ran their businesses. Or if Kevin Ranahan and Paul DeSalles were eating lunch at their, cult restaurant at the bottom first floor of that building, we'd have to, bust their table and wash their dishes or something like that. So we were in proximity, but that was not access. That was not power. That was just, them observing us to make sure we were being humbled enough.
You mentioned something about the signing of the covenant, and I wonder what the
Well,
consequences
it's
would
not a
be.
it's not a signing. It's a vow. You stand on the floor, surrounded in a fishbowl by the entire group, and you make a vow in front of everybody.
What age are people typically when they take that vow?
So in the beginning of People of Praise, they're recruiting graduate students. So they would start off at maybe like 23 to 27. They'd be underway from anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And during the period of being underway, they would live in something called household, where the single person looking to join lives within a family. And the goal is to have family life, an ideal People of Praise life modeled for that person, so that the People of Praise leaders don't need to explain in great detail what it looks like, but also so they don't put it in writing.
Mm.
This very quickly becomes apparent why. Um, and that modeling of life is how you're expected to live. And if you don't make it, you wash out and disappear, and they move on to the next person. So you might end up making the covenant about the age of, like, let's say 25 to 30. And at that point, you've probably had something called a discernment, which is whether you and your People of Praise head have determined that either you're going to live single for the Lord or you're going to get married. And so that all kind of happens in very quick order. It's not like someone makes the covenant and then just goes off and lives this dating lifestyle, hoping to seek a husband or a wife, whatever it may be. Basically, when you make the covenant, you're either already married to someone who's going to also make the covenant, or you're going to be married within a couple months.
If you are single and there's not anybody immediately available for you to marry, you would then join the brotherhood or sisterhood.
Not necessarily, and that's a big problem, because in the 70s, the majority of people involved in the charismatic renewal were women. Even though all the leaders were men, it attracted a vastly disproportionate amount of women. I believe it was 3 to 1, for some communities. And so they had an issue with finding enough men. And so Paul DeSalles again comes up with a strategy. His strategy for encouraging not only his own members to do his bidding, but also for recruiting, and all his subordinates demonstrate the same pattern of behavior as emasculation. He's going to challenge men's manhood and say that, only real men live this, like, all out Christianity that we practice. And if you don't, you're not a real man. And growing up, I heard this phrase over and over and over again. I was just like, oh, he's a man's man. I don't even know what that means, but they said it, and the insinuation was that, like, this was a rugged individualism who could wear a cowboy hat, gallop across the American West, and survive and provide for his family all on his own. He didn't need anyone else. Who are you to tell him, what to do? He's the model that you should seek to be. Like, it's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. But I mean, that's kind of like the goal. And Paul Lascelles is not like this embodiment of manliness. He's not working out. He's not ripped and muscular or tall. Um, he he's a physics professor. I mean, you would see him and someone tells you he's a physics professor, and you're like, yeah, I see it. Like, so it's kind of strange, but like that was the personality he employed, and it proved effective. They were able to balance out their numbers and you know have marriages and grow. And um, in the very beginning, arranged marriages were something that primarily
Mm.
only people of praise leaders practiced. But within our group, we've been able to kind of track people of praise's arranged marriages, and it's like a set of stairs going up, a 45-degree angle. In the very beginning, it's just the leaders, and today, it's a lot of the young kids because they've lessened the rules for who can make the covenant, but they also use their labor practices where they transport people and their mission trips as a way of encouraging young people to find each other and marry young. So whereas marriages might have occurred at 30, they now occur typically 20 to 25 amongst these missionary groups. And that's kind of like, and it's an unspoken lure for a lot of the kids to go on these mission trips, is like, not only are you going to get this experience and you're going to build the kingdom of God, which is their phrase, but you're going to potentially find your spouse, and they all kind of know it.
So that you can make the covenant, because it's built up to be this big thing that everyone should strive for. My question about the vow itself is, what are the consequences of breaking that vow? But now you've explained it to me. Of course, if you marry somebody and you start a family, immediately there's a lot more there that you are responsible for, or that could potentially be damaged and harmed if you were to say, okay, well, I've made the vow, but I don't actually want anything to do with this. So it makes it harder to then say, I take it back.
Yeah, if you break the covenant, you risk losing your family members, your spouse, your job, your housing in a lot of cases, and all your friendships, because the people of praise will absolutely shun its members. It's done it since the 80s, and I experienced that myself.
In terms of the arranged marriages that you've been able to track, is this more strategy that is employed by the people of praise in terms of pairing certain people from certain families together to gain more of
Yeah,
that influence, do you think?
yes, it absolutely is pairing elite families for leaders, but also, you have to understand their dating policies. Once you become underway, which used to be for graduate school, but now occurs in teenagers and the people of praise. Basically, you're assigned a head, which is supposed to just monitor your spiritual life, but actually, in reality, monitors every aspect about your life. And you have to seek their guidance and who they would allow you to date. So basically, if you're underway in people of praise, you're not supposed to date anyone that your head would not approve of. In the same way, you can't get married without your head's approval. This is a very authoritarian and controlling structure, and it operates down to the individual level. I can't reinforce that enough.
And now that we are seeing some of those recognizable themes of um, homophobia, perhaps anti-LGBT sentiments, or perhaps rhetoric in the households, that I'm going to assume the parents aren't coming up with this material. It's being given to them from leadership, and so for that, there you have that hierarchy, and that ladder. So you have the leaders, the fathers, the mothers, and then the children.
So, an interesting fact about this is, if you remember how I described what's called the Duquesne Weekend and how it was led by Bill Story and Ralph Kiefer. That was in 1967. By 1977, both Ralph Kiefer and Bill Story had divorced their wives and come out of the closet as gay. Um, So this entire movement was started by gay men, but you won't know that by reading their history. One of the women who was at the Duquesne weekend has been most prominent about making materials about it. She's made YouTube videos. She's written books about this, and I've watched her videos and read her books. Her name is Patty Mansfeld, and she's involved in the Catholic Cares Renewal in New Orleans. And she will bend over backwards and contort her words ad infinitum to never mention the name of those two men because they're gay. That's the level of homophobia that's present, and it's very sad. Um, I mean, to have a movement founded by this, to have members who only receive the spiritual experience of receiving the gifts of the Holy Spirit when it was initiated by these two men, and then to ostracize the men who gave you that life-changing experience. I don't even begin to understand these people. I'm not going to justify their actions. I can tell you about it though, and you know, in Bill Story was a professor at Notre Dame for a long time, and he died in 2014. Um, Before his death, and I think about 2008ish or so, Kevin Ranahan and his wife Dorothy approached Bill Story and said, "Hey, if you'll renounce, homosexuality, which is the word they use relentlessly, they refuse to use, LGBTQ or gay. If you renounce homosexuality, we'll allow you back into the fold, Bill. You can come back in and be part of this again." He just looked at them like they were out of their minds. and I wasn't there when this happened. It was related to me, but I think they kind of realized in time that they had screwed up, and one of the reasons why they realized they had screwed up is because two of Kevin Ranahan's children identify as LGBTQ, and I think for them personally, they've probably softened their stance, but they certainly haven't changed the practices of the cult that they lead. This kind of anti-LGBTQ sentiment is on full display, which is
Right.
which is why our group of survivors asked that Amy Coney Barrett recuse herself in a recent court case before the Supreme Court, where LGBTQ members could potentially be allowed to be discriminated against by business owners who are just going to claim that it's their religious belief that this is wrong, and so because we think it's wrong, we can not, allow them public accommodation. What happened was that everyone said in the media, well, they're just trying to, hate on Christians or hate on the Catholics or hate on this or that. But this has nothing to do with religion. This is a cult. It is not part of the Catholic Church in any way, shape, or form. It's simply not. It's a cult run by two men who seek authoritarian control of their members. And the reason they do that is because they want to create this experiment and find the data to renew what they call the church. But that doesn't mean the Catholic Church, it just means Christianity. And they think if they can create like this mathematical model to churn out Christian soldiers over and over and over, no matter what inputs are put into the experiment, then they'll, basically be sainted for their efforts. But it's pretty sick, and it has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with People of Praise's explicit history of discrimination against LGBTQ members that happened while Amy Coney Barrett sat on the board of their schools. She has a proven history of doing this herself, enabling an organization to do it. And that was why we felt, she needed to recuse in that case. And I seriously doubt she is. And that kind of illustrates the risk that having a member of this cult on the Supreme Court poses to the entire country. These people refuse to take accountability for their actions, and they refuse to acknowledge, their history and these things that damage our country.
Did this person then say, well, if two of my children identify that way and they've come out publicly, we just have to shun them and kick them out of the group?
Well, as an adult, you have to go underway and you have to make a covenant. And I think it's telling that those children did not.
Right. Okay. I always think that's interesting. And of course, there's a conversation to be had around nepotism in terms of Amy Coney Barrett's father's role in this group and how, she's kind of been pushed up despite her gender, which is perhaps typically subjugated in the people of praise. But I did want to touch upon other areas of marginalized community groups and the way that they are either treated or perceived by the people of praise in terms of the people of praise online is often described as a secretive far-right fundamentalist Christian sect. I don't know how accurate that is personally, but some of the information you're providing here would lead me to believe that it's not accurate. And with this type of environment often comes racism as well. So I wondered if there is any tones of racism along with anti-LGBT sentiments that you are aware of within the people of praise.
I am not aware of it, but I will say that, most people would call me white. And so I'm probably not qualified to say that there is or isn't. We had uh, almost no African American members. We did have the People of Praise did have groups in the Caribbean, Jamaica and Grenada, and so the residents there would probably to a one identify as black, but or I don't, yeah, but they were their own group, right? Their own little branch. And so it wasn't like they would have to interact with a lot of white people in South Bend. They stayed in Jamaica, we stayed in South Bend, you know. So it's very difficult to say. We had a teacher when I was a kid who was from the island of Grenada, and we made fun of him a lot. I feel bad for it now. I'm sorry, Mr. Jeremiah. But I want to say that it was not racist, that it was because, we were asshole seventh graders or 13-year-olds, and, we just liked his accent. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like it was mean spirited, but we probably gave him a really hard time, and I'm sorry about that.
I feel like kids pick up on things that are particularly different from the rest of the group. If there's one child that's a Jehovah's Witness, for example, and doesn't take part in Christmas activities and things, that might make that child a target, because children are very good at being like, that's not the same as the rest of us, so let's pick fun at that. With the other teachings that the people of praise has, is it explicitly taught that men are above women within the people of praise, or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
Yeah, I mean, they talk about it endlessly, and they refer to it as the roles of men and women. And they basically, when you are underway, or even if you're a member, you'll still go on these things called retreats, where you spend a weekend maybe at like some isolated building in the woods where they kind of teach you things. And I think, they go into the roles of men and women a lot in those kind of retreat environments, but children aren't really exposed to that. But I mean, it didn't take exposure to that. I mean, when you have this authoritarian structure, when it's reinforced in every decision in your home, implicitly that the man is the head of the household, that the woman defers to him. And, like if you are in line for a big punishment, the woman will say, well, wait till your father gets home, then he'll know, then he'll be the one to beat you. Like it's not like it just occurs all the time. It's constant. Um, and people will say, that People of Praise is just this benign little faith group. Oh, we pray together on Sundays, for a couple hours, and it's a lie. This is an all-encompassing cult. For adults, they have a Sunday meeting, in addition to whatever church service they might attend in the morning. But they also have headship meetings throughout the week where they meet with their head and talk to them and tell them the most intimate secrets. They have men's and women's group where men and women of certain ages meet together on a certain night and talk for 2 or 3 hours. They have, if they have children, they're expected to participate in sporting events or Boy Scouts. If they don't have children, their brotherhood and sisterhood, they're expected to lead these Boy Scouts and Girl Scout groups, or they're always finding things to do. If a community member needs a new roof, a bunch of community men will show up and put a new roof on their house. If someone is sick in the hospital, a community mom will be expected to cook them a meal and bring it to them, or bring meals to the family while the other person's in the hospital. It's never ending. This is a cult. It is all encompassing. And because it's all encompassing, they, for the most part, don't talk to anyone outside of it. All your friends very quickly, all your acquaintances very quickly become other people of praise members. And so when I was shunned at age 16 for having the audacity to drop out of their cult high school, basically I lost connections to the majority of people I'd known throughout my entire life. And not only that, but it disparaged my reputation amongst them, and that even filtered down to my extended family who lived in other states. And even then, my extended family started looking at me like, "Oh, he's someone to be ostracized." Like, the intensity of the shunning is crazy, and I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Um, in the 1980s, they shunned a couple or a family called the Ferones, and very public. I mean, this had been the first employee of CRS, their business, and very publicly shunned them and encouraged their members not to talk to them. And because of that, the Ferones, collected information about what they experienced and tried to reach out to other people who'd also been kicked out of the group. And there have been a lot of people who've been kicked out of People of Praise over the years, but they're, even to this day, afraid to speak out. Um, it's difficult to place the reason for their fear, but I suspect it goes back to the initial brainwashing that People of Praise uses to control its members. Um, if you'd like to go into that, I'm happy to go into it.
A lot of groups that have Christian teachings or influence may use doomsday fear tactics, but I don't feel like that is part of this group's rhetoric. So I do wonder if it's the shunning that brings on the fear. I can see that from previous experiences. If you leave, or if you break the covenant, then this is the community and everything that you will lose. But I did wonder, how young does that start, and what messages of fear are they putting onto people in order for them to be like, I can't speak out even though I've left?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily fear that controls them. I mean, I can see how that might be a first analysis upon looking at this group. But and while shunning played a small role, and while Doomsday's prophecies played a small role, they're very minuscule in terms of their overall brainwashing effort. And I don't think I fully understood it until recently. Um, and I think it goes back to their very essence, which is that we're people who have been blessed by God. We've received these gifts of the Holy Spirit. We have exclusive truth, and we're elite. We can heal people with our hands. We can tell the future if God wills it to us. Um, and they have this worldview where they view every bad thing as happening because of a devil. Basically, they view themselves in a constant state of what they call spiritual warfare, where the devil is trying to do bad things to them as God's chosen people, and where they're combating it with their gifts of the Holy Spirit. Um, and exorcisms play a big part in that, where they will lay their hands on someone and pray and be said to cast out the evil spirit, and then that person is kind of renewed and able to build the kingdom of God again. But very quickly, as a child, you realize this is coercive, because, like, I guess as a child I could accept that all of that nonsense. But I mean, like, because you're just a child, it's very easy to think in binary terms of good and bad, and devil and God, and this war, and casting out these things. But very quickly you realize the first time your parents are like, well, you took a piece of candy that wasn't yours, you're possessed by an evil spirit, let me cast it out of you. You're like,
Mm.
this is bullshit. I don't think any deity cares whether I eat a piece of candy or not. And that is a ridiculous example, but I mean, it's just like these kind of insignificant things. You realize that, if there is this grand battle for our souls and, the world, like, it certainly doesn't involve this minuscule aspect of my life.
The
Um,
words that you used before around elitism, and truth, that's the kind of thing that led me to think, and online articles describing this group as a secret Christian sect. Those types of words make me think of esotericism and groups that claim to have hidden knowledge, secret knowledge that only they have, that only they can share with people that are, either enlightened enough or indoctrinated enough, maybe, or higher up enough in the ranks to be gifted this information. You can think about Scientology, you can think about various different groups that might employ similar tactics to this. But the big question that comes to my mind is, how is it that Amy Coney Barrett has been allowed to stay in the group if she's a woman that's in politics, in government, that has gone on to have a career that typically is more reserved for men in some fundamentalist groups? Is it that it's her father's role in the early implementation of the group that plays a part? Or is it trying to get people in those positions of power, no matter who they are? Because
so
it's difficult to balance that, men over women, and women, this is your role, and, men, this is your role. But then also, women can become part of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So I know this is a lot of questions and a lot of information. I sometimes can't articulate myself, but I wondered if you would be able to really um unpack for the listeners this weird juxtaposition, contradictory thing that's happening, um that allows the people of praise to have both sides of the fence almost.
So, in a lot of military settings, you have the general, and then there's a general chain of command all the way down to privates. Um, in the case of people of praise, you have two generals, and then you have the authoritarian structure underneath them. A lot of people will make the point that she's a woman, but that is not a limiting factor in their minds. You have to think about it in terms of the authoritarian structure. Yes, there is misogyny throughout the cult, but there's also this structure that overrides everything. So, for instance, Dorothy Ranahan, Kevin Ranahan's wife, if you were comparing this to a military, she would be a lieutenant, and she'd be over thousands of men. You know, she's a woman, but her submission is to her husband, and this notion of submission is what's important. Um, it's not that you are submissive to every man. That would be a ludicrous thing, and it wouldn't even fit in to like misogynistic culture, right? Misogynistic culture is like, I'm a man, I control you because you're my woman, right? So no man would allow other men to control his wife within that kind of thinking. It would be ludicrous. Um, so think about it in terms of that. Like, no other man is controlling Amy Coney Barrett. I think she would say that by joining People of Praise, she put herself under submission to her husband. And because of the conditioning of People of Praise and its underway process, she probably wouldn't think of that as a negative reaction. Um, she probably also, would be under submission to Kevin Ranahan himself. During the time when she was underway, she was being groomed by him in his house in South Bend. And I can't reinforce that enough. I also can't enforce enough that this isn't the first time People of Praise has tried to do this. Like I said, they've always been trying to put their people in positions of power. And, they got really lucky with Amy Coney Barrett. There's no amount of strings they could ever pull realistically to put her themselves in that position. They certainly created the conditions that allowed her to get there. They created the influence that allowed her to get there. But they got a lot of luck too. But their whole goal was not to say empirically, well, we can do this time and time again. It was just to try and do it, because their goal overarchingly was to overturn abortion. The first person they tried to do this with, they also funded his education through Notre Dame Law School and pushed him into political career, trying to get, a similar type of result. And I think when he lost a national election, they moved on to Amy Coney Barrett next. But I don't think the first person they tried with this had a head. So, which means they didn't have this kind of authoritarian structure leading to them at the bottom. Basically, it went Kevin Ranahan, then them. So they were kind of like on par with the lieutenant within the military structure, but they were still in submission. And in their kind of mindset, your willingness to submit to a goal larger than yourself, to accept a purpose larger than yourself, is what's important. That's how they justify it to their members. They don't justify it in terms of, hey, join our misogynistic cult. They say, hey, we know what's up. We'll give you a purpose, because that's what every human being craves. And people do. I've experienced that myself. And it had nothing to do with People of Praise. You want to lead a meaningful life and do something important. And so that's kind of how they hook people.
Some may say that your purpose is to do with People of Praise. It's just not working with them. It's funny that people find their place in activism. When you explain Amy Coney Barrett's position in that way, is it almost then like she is just a mouthpiece and there is a puppet master? So when she is making decisions at one of the highest points in the country, it's somebody else telling her which direction she should be going in with votes and things like that? Or is she independent in that way?
I mean, she's independent. No one is telling her what to do. I can't imagine that she would risk communicating directly with Ranahan or Giselles. But here's the thing. When you join a group like this, when you make a conscious decision and put years of effort, not only to joining, but going through their motions to get to the point where you're allowed to join, you've made your choice. You've made all of your choices. When you join People of Praise, you were saying, I am against abortion. I'm against contraception. I believe that I have elite knowledge, that it's my job and my job alone to build the kingdom of God, that, we are the ones who are chosen to do this and we're going to do it. That's what you're saying. And, they build the kingdom of God as their language. And what they're trying to do is, use every tool within their toolkit to bring that about. No one needs to be told. And it's not just Amy Coney Barrett. None of the members need to be told. They've made their choice a long time ago, and that's what I would try and emphasize. I feel like it's pretty much the same in every cult. Like when you make a decision to join this group, you've already chosen. No one needs to instruct you or manipulate you. You've already made the decision. One of the things that in my research I found most interesting, though, gets back to the foundational thing that began this, which is praying in tongues. And the People of Praise has a very unique way of doing it. As a kid, everyone had kind of the same experience. We laughed at our parents as they did this, because it sounds like gobbledygook. Like you can hear the cacophony of all this group doing it at once, and it's powerful. But you can also hear the dad next to you going hubba hubba hubba, and you're just like, what? Like It's ridiculous. But the reality is their version of it is very powerful and very unique. And I'd like to play you a couple minutes
Yes,
of
please.
what it sounds like. It was very difficult to find this, so I'm just gonna play the whole couple minutes of it if that's okay. Because what happens is in their prayer meetings, um, the vast majority of them is singing these praise songs that are joyful and loud and involved and enthusiastic. But then immediately after some of the songs, something organic will happen where it's quiet and people just kind of crescendo into what I would call singing in tongues. And then it kind of naturally descends. And at the descent is usually when you'll start hearing a teaching or a sharing or maybe a prophecy from one of the leaders.
Right.
So the effect of that is interesting because psychologists can analyze and they can say, well, when you're singing, when you're doing these things, you're using a part of your brain that doesn't involve rational thought, and you're kind of lulled into a trance state. Trance is, in the academic terms, is right, but people's perception of that word is that you're like and controlled by a cobra. It's not like that. It's just that you're not using your full rational capabilities. So then when you immediately receive something, it's more plausible for you to believe it without putting too much thought into it. So I'm gonna play this for you right now. Give me just a second. So then there's a descent and it gets quiet. And this is all orchestrated behind the scenes, but if you're a member, you experience it very organically. And then if I told you, hey, Casey, God just put something in my mind. Casey, I want you to go down to the park and build a temple. God's going to provide you all the materials, but you need to dedicate the next year of your life to building a temple for God. Casey, are you willing
Oh,
to stand up in front of all your friends and accept this? And so, because you've been lulled into that state, you're like, oh my God, God is talking about me. And typically, that's an extreme example. Typically, no one is put on the spot. Typically, you know, um, it's not that direct. It's usually someone stands up and speaks as if they're God, and they'll say, "My people, I call onto you to do such and such and such and such." But I wanted you to see if you could feel it, if you could feel like that.
how do you feel listening to that now? Do you have any type of reaction?
I mean, I think I would have been repulsed as a teenager when I first got away from it. Um, I've done a lot of work. I'm pretty reflective, and I can handle this without having a reaction to it, I think. Um, but one of the things that I found most interesting in my research was a book called The Psychology of Praying in Tongues. It was written by a Christian psychologist actually in 1972, before People of Praise even really got going. And he did an empirical study that was so well done that no one has challenged it or written any other books about this ever since. Basically, this book is cited as an authoritative analysis of what praying in tongues does. And what he found was that by conducting experiments with control groups and people who believed in this, that praying in tongues is sort of like hypnotism. I don't know if you know much about it, but basically, hypnotism, there's a subset of the population that can be hypnotized and a subset of the population that can't. It's not like staring into the eyes of a cobra. It's just you have individuals are kind of almost born with a propensity for it based on the amount of trust they're capable in bestowing others. People of Praise or Praying in Tongues is exactly like that. The psychologist found, and as I was reading his book, there were two paragraphs that really stood out to me, and I'll read them to you. He said the principal difference between tongue speakers and non-tongue speakers is that tongue speakers develop deeply trusting and submissive relationships to the authority figures who introduce them to the practice. Without complete submission to the leader, speaking in tongues was not initiated. In psychotherapy, this is called dependent transference.
Mhm.
Researchers noted repeatedly that people who did not speak in tongues had a different relationship to authority figures than did the tongue speakers. There were no loners among the tongue speakers. They banded together and were mutually supporting. They never met a deeply involved tongue speaker who did not have some leader to whom they looked for guidance. Even in casual questioning about their glossolalia experiences, which is academic Catholicism for praying in tongues, tongue speakers very quickly mentioned the name of the person whom they revered as their model for tongue speaking. So think about what his results were, and now think about nefarious individuals. If you were like a mentalist or some sort of con artist looking for a way to trick people, and you were reading this book and you read those 2 paragraphs, you would be like, holy shit, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell people to pray in tongues. And all of a sudden, overnight, just like what happened with people of praise, you've got an army of followers who are willing to do what you say because you're the leader. And the most interesting dynamic is in the survivors of people of praise, the kids that we meet, we want nothing to do with people of praise. We know intrinsically that its practices are wrong. But whenever one of the group members is perceived to be a leader, all of the people have a strange reaction. Some of them will either start deferring to that person who's taking on an air of authority, and some of them will react violently and push them away irrationally, even though they probably have done nothing wrong to the person. There's something built into us as survivors of this cult where we have like these visceral reactions to the perception of leadership because of this very thing. And in my opinion, it all comes back to this practice of praying in tongues and people's susceptibility to it. And I feel like, the analysis of this book, just lends credence to that.
I am recalling so many conversations I've had with individuals who have been placed in environments where speaking in tongues is a big part of the religious practice. And I'm thinking about people who had silent rebellions where they refused to join in. They knew it was fake, they knew it was weird, and they just decided that they weren't going to take part. I have in my mind people who really prayed for the gift, asked for the gift, did what they could. And eventually, one day, the pressure became so much that they just began speaking in gobbledygook. And everybody around them showered them with so much praise and happiness for finally getting the gift, which I say in air quotes for everyone listening, that the person twigged in the moment, oh my goodness, that's all I had to do was just pretend. Maybe everyone else is pretending. I am thinking about that acceptance in that conformity that you've just explained there in all of the people who spoke about speaking in tongues. They're part of the group now. They're part of the collective, and the people that never got the gift are the silent rebellions, who are the nefarious ones on the outskirts. And it's in terms of all of the conversations that I've had with people and their various experiences in speaking in tongues, mostly from Pentecostal or Pentecostal adjacent groups, as we've talked about the influences of that being in this group, I think that's absolutely fascinating what you've just read there. And that was the 70s as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would encourage everyone to read that book. The author's name is Kildall, published in 1972. It's excellent, and the fact that the study has never been challenged and that everyone, who's a psychologist at least, understands the work that went into the analysis and the experiments that he conducted to reach those conclusions, sees that it's very valuable. He did a lot of work too. I can read you more if you're interested.
I think that it's definitely something I want to get the full title of for the episode description. And you mentioned another book as well, which I think would be about the cult of the
Catholic cult
special.
of the Paraclete.
That's it, the Paraclete. That's it. So I'll make sure I get the information for those books from you, along with links to the clips that you've played, so that I can put them clearly in the episode, and edit them in. And if anybody wants to go and find out some more about that, we can include those bits in as well. I think that would be great. So in terms of some of the other practices within the people of praise that people listening might recognize from their own experiences, or maybe from other episodes that have come out on the podcast, you're not really restricted with your relationships. You're not explicitly told that you can't go out and make friends outside of the group, but so much of your life is dominated by group related activities that it quickly becomes known that, or at least implied, that the majority of your connections will be from people within the group. Are you restricted implicitly or explicitly in other ways in terms of, well, I guess leisure time we've already covered, your clothing, or your diet? And are there like substances that are forbidden, like we see in some groups? Tobacco, gambling, drugs, caffeine?
Obviously they would have looked down on illicit drugs, but I think it was more because of that would have involved law breaking and, you know, going against another authoritarian structure, which would be the laws of the country, right? They're very big on authority. So if your authority says you can do it, it's fine. When I was a kid, they used to have something once a year called a men's night, and the men would gather in their giant hotel in South Bend, and they'd smoke cigars and they'd gamble and play cards. And if you were 13 or older, you could come as well, and you could observe the men doing these things and even participate, you know. And one year, when I was probably 14, I guess, which would have been like the early 90s, you know, some of the moms found out what was happening. They found out that their underage sons were, you know, smoking Pinocchio style at this debaucherous men's only event. And that put an end to it. From then on, men's night was only like prayer, and there was no more of the hyper masculine out, you know, masculine each other kind of thing that politics has encouraged. And I'm sure it probably wavered back and forth too. I'm sure the other behavior came back and then was, you know, everything kind of moved in waves and cycles, because I can't emphasize this enough. It was like an experiment. This is a group where, you know, you were encouraged not to deal with outsiders. All of them kind of sent their kids to the same Catholic elementary school, but because they need a control group, bring in the Protestant family. I went to public school. All my friends
Right.
before the age of 12 were not in the cult. They were public school friends that I made. And I was very resentful of having to go to their cult school, you know, once I turned 13. And, you know, I didn't appreciate that. And the reason that was allowed is not because, like, you know, they thought it was okay. They didn't think our lifestyle was okay, or I was okay, or my beliefs were okay, but they needed a control group to see if they could manipulate me too. Because it doesn't matter that I'm Protestant, it matters that I'm in the cult, right? So this has nothing to do with religious belief, and I can't emphasize that enough. It's a cult. They want to control you and manipulate you, and that's all they care about. Everything else is allowed to vary, you know, to an extent, as long as they can get data on it for their manipulative practices later on.
There's a few groups that come to mind when you talk about some of the details of the people of praise. I've thought about other groups that have attempted to infiltrate government levels. I've thought about Amshin Rikyo of Rajneeshpuram and their kind of bio-terrorism attempts to overthrow votes and get their people involved in the local community to take over the local town. I've thought about the Unification Church. There's not mass weddings in the People of Praise, but you know, arranged weddings across both. The New Yorker Hotel, which is owned by the Unification Church, and the People of Praise having this hotel you talked about, and also the Unification Church having the True World Foods Group, I believe is the name, or something similar to that, which is the #1 distributor of sushi within America. And then you're talking about the People of Praise at one point having a central main business that distributes, right, like propaganda basically to various different outlets throughout America. So I'm drawing these parallels between certain well-renowned cults in history and the people of praise, and how a lot of these groups have been described as businesses and not religious groups. But then what is the biggest striking difference is the numbers. These groups that we're talking about, hundreds, thousands of followers all around the world. The difference with the people of praise is, as you've mentioned, in comparison, it's pretty minuscule, especially if you're looking at the Unification Church in the height of its kind of glory. What is it that sets the people of praise apart in terms of being able to amass as much influence and power in certain places, but with the smaller numbers, would you say?
I mean, I think it would boil down to recruitment. I mean, they're recruiting people who they know are going to be elite and who are going to be susceptible to their own messages of elitism. Um, the connection to Notre Dame is a very powerful one, because it is, the preeminent Catholic institution or college in the country, and because they're in that city, they wield a different kind of power. Ann Arbor is also in a university city. There's the University of Michigan there, which is a very well-respected university, but it's not Catholic. It's a public school, and the the group that was in Ann Arbor was able to grow quickly and much larger than the United States, frankly, or much larger than People of Praise, but they never had access to the same kind of Catholic power players that People of Praise did, simply by being at Notre Dame. Because they were in that city and because they ran a school in that city, they could educate the children of professors at Notre Dame. One of the most, and this is documented in Politico, news site in the United States, but Bill Kelly is a professor at Notre Dame Law School. He sent his kids to the People of Praise's Trinity School in South Bend. So there's that connection right there. And he was one of the most influential players in the Federalist Society and at Notre Dame Law School, pushing for Amy Coney Barrett to be nominated. I mean,
Right.
that's the kind of connection that you forge. There's a Republican power player. He was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel during the Ronald Reagan administration in the 80s. After that, he moved to South Bend and taught at Notre Dame Law School. Sent his kids to the People of Praise School, Trinity Schools in South Bend. I mean, you see this pattern over and over and over again. People of Praise also operates at a school in Washington, D.C. So a presidential contender like Rick Santorum, sends his kids to the People of Praise School in Washington, D.C. Mike Pence, who was born a Catholic, now is an evangelical, was the governor of Indiana. And his favorite high school was the highest performing high school in Indiana, the People of Praise School in South Bend. I mean, it never ends, And when you go after elite people, you get elite people because elite people don't want to be associated with, middle class people. It's not so different than England, where you have a rigid class system. When you say you're elite and you only allow elite people in, that's what you get.
Yeah, I read a news article this morning that said, will the British people swear their allegiance to the king? And I was like, that's dodgy. I don't like the way that sounds. I don't want to swear my allegiance to anybody. I don't want to, like, no, thank you. So I get that kind of classism over here in the UK. I feel like everybody I surround myself with is probably a working class and left leaning, but that's just my echo chamber. Amy Coney Barrett being in this position then has in some ways been able to happen because there are faithful, devoted People of Praise members dotted all around the place in significant positions that will pull her up to the next rung of the ladder until she gets to the point that she's at now. Is that a fair assumption to make?
I don't know that it's necessarily them pulling her up a ladder per se. I think almost all Catholics had a visceral reaction to the decision of Roe v. Wade that allowed abortion in the United States. That happened in 1973, 2 years after People of Praise was formed. And they've had that as their central mission to overturn that. And so, what people see when they're kind of adjacent to People of Praise, meaning they live in a city like South Bend or Washington, they see these schools, they see these parents and these kids who are highly motivated to not only achieve success, but also to overturn abortion. They see someone that they can align themselves with, even if they don't join the People of Praise themselves. And so it's not that people were pulling her up, it's that they saw a motivated individual. And the People of Praise was what allowed these connections to be made because they had these schools, because they could find people who were in alignment. And so I think People of Praise got lucky that she was nominated. It certainly helped that, so many influential members of the Federalist Society were members of Notre Dame Law School where she taught. That was probably a bigger influence than People of Praise money. But I don't think we can also underestimate, the amount of money that moved around behind the scenes, and it's almost untraceable in the United States. But People of Praise is not a poor institution. It would not be hard for them to pull out millions and make payments and things like that. There's no proof of that. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm just saying, like, they have the resources, they have the connections to allow people to gain access to positions of power. And
Mm-hmm.
that's their modus operandi. I mean, like, they've have members who are high up in the military in the United States. They have members who are, in the executive suites of powerful corporations in the United States. They have one of, the kids who graduated from attorney school. I think she was 2 years younger than me. Was one of the chief legal advisors to President Trump. I mean, the achievement that these people have achieved without is completely disproportionate to their numbers. But you brought up the unification in church, and there's kind of an interesting comparison there. There's a book called Recovering from Cults, and a professor of anthropology at UCLA actually, came up with a thesis. She said, I don't think the unification church can indoctrinate me or brainwash me. I know all about brainwashing and psychological control. So I'm going to go to one of their weekend retreats and see what happens. I don't think they can do it. And so she goes, and they allow her to sing. And she sings these joyful songs, and all the members love bomb her. And at the end of the weekend, she has someone pick her up, and she has to get deprogrammed for like a week because they convinced her that there was nothing wrong with the Unification Church, that they were all just good people singing songs of joy and praise, even though she knew that that wasn't the truth. She knew all the facts of what they actually did. And so, I mean, I think that's an apt comparison, like, you can be smart, you can be an intelligent person, but if you happen to be in the subset of the population that's just inherently susceptible to praying in tongues or something similar like the Unification Church used in their recruitment methods, you could fall into something like this. And it is a real danger to our country and to countries like, the UK. The People of Praise planted a group in London. It's still there.
I think that's so strange. Every time people say to me, "Oh yeah, there's a pretty big successful chapter over in the UK," I know that there are, as Margaret Singer would say, that I know that there are cults in our midst. I know they're everywhere. I have letters from Jehovah's Witnesses come through the letterbox. I have people, knock on the door, do you want to buy any Avon products? But I still feel like even after all these episodes and all of these conversations, I still feel like it's not something that I need to worry about on my doorstep, even though I know that it is. It's such a strange thing. So when I was down in London last year at CrimeCon, we stayed in this really nice hotel and the convention played out. And then somebody said to me, "Oh, hey, you should go down the road and visit the Scientology building before you leave." And I was like, "What? There's what do you mean? And they were like, oh, it's just the Centre for Scientology in London. It's just around the corner. And I kid you not, the hotel was touching the building for Scientology in London, and I'd just been there the whole weekend, and I'd been feet away from it. And outside the front, there was a sign that said free personality tests, and somebody was joking saying, oh, let's go in and get one. And for those reasons that you just said, Pete, with this woman going away with the Unification Church for a weekend, I just said, please, no one ever go into that building, even as a joke, for a free personality test, because
What's
you
wrong with
just
it?
don't know.
It's just a reading room. What could it hurt you?
Oh gosh, you just don't know. You just don't know what's going to happen with those things. So I am not surprised to hear that there is a People of Praise group over here, and it still exists, and it's probably doing quite well in certain areas and demographics of London, no less, the most
Active.
expensive place it is yet to live in. Like, oh my goodness. But at the same time, I still feel like it's so far away from me. It's a strange thing to kind of balance in my mind. But how was it that you eventually left? You mentioned being shunned at 16. So how, when, and why did that happen? And what were your immediate steps following that decision?
I would say that I was a pretty average kid within the People of Praise. I certainly wasn't groomed for leadership. I wasn't looked at someone as a model. I mean, I kind of just, existed, right? I did all the things that were expected of me. I didn't cause problems. I got good grades, even at their school. Um, I just did what was expected of me. And I'd been conditioned to be that way because of the way I was raised. And um, but then when I was 16 ish, I was going through a tough time, and I couldn't sleep at night. And like when you can't sleep day after day, you just lose an ability to focus. And they were aware of it. I mean the dean of the school talked to me and said, we know something's not right with you. You want to talk about it? I mean, they were kind of friendly, but it wasn't like these were not the kind of people that you bring your secrets to. Like you certainly were not going to tell them because you knew that you tell one person, it goes up the chain of command. Like, and I wasn't really trying to join the People of Praise. I wasn't going to participate in that system. But after a couple of days of this, I was just like losing my ability to function, and I kind of stopped going to school, and then I dropped out. And even though I got in straight A's before that, it wasn't like I had done some disrespectful thing or spoken to a newspaper about People of Praise, which would have occurred to me back then. Um, but because I dropped out, it was seen as like I shunned them first, I guess. I don't know. But they absolutely shunned me. There were parents who refused to allow their kids to be around me. Um, I just wasn't welcome anymore. And it's not like I wanted to be around those people either. But at the same time, it's very disconcerting when you're so young to lose all of your connections to almost everyone you've ever known. I can't emphasize that enough. To lose like the foundation underneath you when you're at a vulnerable age is just, it was terrible.
What was your parents' reaction to that? Do they kind of kick you out of the home, or do you stay at home and it's a strained relationship?
Oh, I haven't spoken to um, my mother since then. My dad died when I was 15. My brother and I had a kind of an off and on relationship. He was much more susceptible to their brainwashing. So he and I struggled as teenagers, but then he went away to college and seemed to kind of normalize. And so we had probably 4 or 5 years where we were on good terms when he was away from them. But unfortunately, he moved back to South Bend after college. And one day, he just called me up and said, "Hey, because I'm a journalist, he asked me if I could edit a speech he was going to give to a business association. And it was called Christians in Commerce. It's something that People of Praise runs to kind of bring in powerful business leaders into alignment with their goals. But people talking there all the time. I didn't realize at the time that he would join, but as soon as I read his speech, I realized that, he had submitted himself to one of the People of Praise lieutenants as his personal head. And I was just like, what the fuck are you doing? You know these people. Like, why are you doing this? And he couldn't understand why I was so mad. And we haven't spoken since. I refuse to allow those people to be around me or my family now. I mean, I know the dangers of authoritarianism, and it's something that creeps up on you. It's not something that like goose steps up to your front door, you know and makes you give away all the Jews. It's something that like you know creeps up and influences people to the point where they don't stand up when they see an injustice, and all before you know it, everyone is behaving the same way and you're on the outside. And I refuse to allow those people to be around me. And I'm not going to be quiet about the dangers of having one of their members on the Supreme Court. It, I personally am against, what she did to the decision in Roe v. Wade. It the right to an abortion is fundamental to leading a life of self-determination. And it's an important women's right. And, I'll continue to voice that opinion. But the real danger is creeping authoritarianism and the separation of church and state that could be eroded
Oh
by her
gosh.
position. Because she's not
It
just any Supreme Court justice, she's the fifth vote, the deciding vote on controversial issues. Allowing someone like that, the kind of position, the power that she now wields, is dangerous to everything in our country.
yeah. What you've just said there is giving me like goosebumps all over. My arms are the discussion around the separation of church and state is, I feel like it is a polarizing conversation. Everything in the political, socio-economic, religious climate, everything is so polarized at the moment. Blue and red, and guns and no guns, and religion and no religion. And it's it's hard to sit down and have a rational conversation when there is silos of liberalism, left wing, right wing, extremist, right wing, far right, dominion theology, Christian nationalism, fascism coming in, right? So even when I say that, you can kind of guess that I'm left leaning. And I feel like between Amy Coney Barrett and Marjorie Taylor Greene and these women who are in these positions of power that should be protecting women's rights are doing the opposite of those things. I can't wrap my head around it, Pete. It's when I speak to Dr. Clint Haycock, he says to me that America has been working on dominion for decades, decades and decades. And now all of that is coming to fruition in things like Roe versus Wade being overturned, in things like LGBT rights being brought into question and being threatened and being kind of thrown in for being overturned. And then you start to think about just human rights, women's rights, equal rights for people. It's a really scary time because when you have somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, who has been raised in this environment, who isn't having somebody in her ear telling her, this is what you should be doing, this is how you should be voting, when she has been indoctrinated to understand how to vote for damaging and dangerous and potentially extremist far right thinking, just from her influences and upbringing, she knows how to further the agenda. She knows what the agenda is and what the best decision would be to allow that agenda to gain more traction. And if that is getting rid of abortion laws, she's been successful there. If there are other missions that groups like the People of Praise have, or other groups that are seeking to blur the lines further between church and state, I don't know what else she could be responsible for. It's really scary.
Well,
And I'm not even over there. I'm in the UK, but we all kind of mirror each other when it comes to these big things.
The next thing in our country is going to be an effort to ban contraception. And you can see the start of it now where they're trying to ban the pills that allow the majority of abortions. But they're also going to target, just over the counter contraceptives and condoms and things like that. And that can be framed a lot of ways. I mean, I think the most obvious will be that they'll try and frame it along the lines of race, but I don't think that's how the people of praise will see it. I think they see it as, they need Catholic children to renew the church. Not just Catholics, but Christian children who are going to renew the church in whatever form or manifestation that might take. The Catholic charismatic renewal might perceive it through Catholic lens. Evangelicals may perceive it through their lens, but I think the goal is really the same: to outbreed their enemies. They need as many people as possible. But I'd also like to point out, what you said about polarization. A lot of times this is framed along the polarizing lines of abortion or as women's rights versus some other ideal, right? This also affects me as a man. The thing that would happen that they target after contraception would be in vitro fertilization. That's how my son was born. Because of what I suffered, in the people of praise, I wasn't able to have kids, on my own. I had to use a scientific procedure to have them, and it's a procedure that they'll view as, in line with their abortion theory, that every life is precious. And in vitro, what happens is, a lot of eggs are fertilized, and a lot of them are discarded because they're just not viable. But because these people are ignorant of their science, or because they might know the science but choose their personal belief over the scientific reality, they say that discarding those, unviable eggs is murder. Or even if they were viable and they only wanted to have one child instead of 20, that's murder. It's not. You know, this willful disregard of science, especially when it comes to human reproduction, um, affects everyone. It's not just women's rights.
Yep.
It's affected me personally. And to act like this is only something the women should decide is ludicrous too, just on its face value. I mean, I love women. I have a wife. I have family. Like, this idea that men are only out for themselves and wanting to subjugate women just isn't a reality. Maybe there's that perception within the people of praise, but just not in the real world, right? Like, trying to frame it as just women's rights, I feel like, is also a polarization that tries to divide us from doing the rational thing, you
Yep.
know?
Yep. And you mentioned before when you first began talking about Roe v. Wade, you said, I support women's rights. I think that women should have access to this, treatment and service if they need it. And immediately in my mind, I was thinking it is women, but it affects everybody.
Mhm.
Imagine, imagine a wife is pregnant and it's an ectopic pregnancy, and it's life threatening. Imagine the decision then, like the family has to make, or to be a part of, or to witness, like the husband and the father of the other children, if there are other children, right? Okay, so you're going to lose your wife then. Okay. And what about same-sex couples that use these different procedures and medical treatments to have children? Is this just another way to attack, like, other people's abilities to start families and have families? Like, it's just, I know. And what you said about oh, I can't remember what it was. It's something that is very important to me. And feel I feel it in my heart every time there's a news story that comes out about a young child that is pregnant and is not allowed to receive the medical treatment that the child needs to be a child and not give birth to a child. It's like heartbreaking stuff. And it's really scary to think about what could come next if this has been allowed to happen. And then you have news stories that that say this is what's happening, and then other news stories that say actually this is what's happening, and it's just pitting people against each other. It's just you versus me and me versus you, and I feel like we should just be looking at individuals on a case to case basis. Like you can't just put a blanket over everybody and say this is how we live now. Like the article about like your allegiance to King Charles. I don't want to give my allegiance to anybody, and I don't want to be forced to live by somebody else's Bible or somebody else's religious beliefs. That's absolutely so backwards. It's just so backwards to me. So I apologize for getting on my soapbox, but I did warn people at the start of this episode that we were going to get political today, and here we are in the political space.
No, it's definitely very concerning. These kind of efforts divide us. And I think that only goes to further illustrate that People of Praise as a cult is seeking to control. If you look at all the religions of the world, whether you view them as empirically right or wrong, they're all basically trying to answer a singular question, which is why are we here and what is our purpose? And if the purpose is to divide and hate, I don't think these religions would have gained much traction. Almost all of them have gained traction because of ideas about love. And I just don't see any love in any of these actions.
You mentioned before we hit record that your aim and mission going forward is to research, learn, work with others to prevent this group from being able to harm any more children. Is there a way that other people from different groups that feel encouraged by your story today, is there any advice that you would give to those people in terms of going down the same route of attempting to take preventative measures against potentially extremist groups?
Um, this is one of the last things I really like to highlight is that People of Praise, the experience of growing up in it was one of experiencing hypocrisy constantly, constantly being told to do one thing and seeing adults do something else. One of the things that I find most interesting about People of Praise, that in the vast array of all their beliefs and their teachings on how human beings should live and live in a community with each other, they never have anything to say about truth and honesty. And in fact, in their very founding documents, they have clauses about secrecy and protecting things and how information should go to the top but not in reverse. I think it's really important to understand the nature of that, the mendacity of their entire organization. In 1980, the National Catholic Reporter newspaper published an article about People of Praise specifically, and only them, after a large number of their members left, alleging that Kevin Ranahan specifically and other leaders were engaging in brainwashing. It was in the headline of the article. It's easily found online if people actually looked. But people rarely look beyond the latest news cycle. They don't want the history. They don't want to understand. They just want to talk about the here and now. But this happened in 1980. It's very easily found. And People of Praise reacted to that article not by issuing a statement. In fact, they said nothing at all. The reason they said nothing at all is because they don't care what other people think about them. They only want to control the people involved in their membership. That was their ultimate calculation. And it proved okay. There was no fallout for them to not responding to that article. Nothing happened. They haven't honestly responded to anything that's been written about them since. And what's happened? No one investigates them for their crimes. No one does anything about them because they cloak themselves in a religion, even though they're not. The fundamental thing that I would say about People of Praise that applies to any group is that they lie. And they lie constantly and all the time. And That's not part of any religion in this world. If you are part of a group or a leadership structure or anything where you're constantly being lied to or gaslit, that's not religion. It's simply not. Because it doesn't go to that fundamental question of why we're here. It's just one other human being trying to manipulate another. That's a cult.
There's lying, there's almost certainly a way to find nuggets of truth in those things that have been happening as well, because lies leave trails and stories aren't straight. If there's lies, there's most likely cover-ups, and if there's cover-ups, there's most likely evidence. And the hypocrisy that you mentioned, being subjected to your entire childhood, has been explicit in some of the showcases that the people of praise do. The singing is supposed to be to show you one thing, but the agenda of that singing is something else. Going to run down neighborhoods to fix up houses is to show the community that the people of praise want to do one thing when actually it's to do something else. This hypocrisy, the gaslighting you mentioned before we hit record, it sounds like it's another MO of the people of praise. It seems like it's kind of part of the identity and core of this group to do one thing, house single people into families and say, this is what a people of praise family looks like, when those people have been coerced and indoctrinated into behaving and thinking in a certain way. That's not an authentic representation of how every family exists within that environment. So even that is hypocritical in terms of, this is how we are and this is truly how we are. So I imagine that your journey to recovery, you mentioned that you've done a lot of work on yourself before we hit the record button. You said that you are in a good place now to talk about your experiences and everything's on the table. But I imagine 16 years old, grieving the community that you've had your whole life, your father who passed when you were 15, your mother who hasn't spoken to you since you were 16, and the tumultuous relationship with your brother, grieving all of these different elements of your life and coming to terms with the fact that the group taught you one thing, but always meant something else. Is there anything you can tell the listeners before we finish today in how you've been able to come on that journey, balancing all of those things as a teenager up to your activism work today in whistleblowing on this group and allowing the public to hear what the people of praise are actually all about, not just how they show themselves?
I wouldn't call it grieving for my family relationships. I certainly, it wasn't that my mother didn't speak to me. It's that I don't want a relationship with her. My brother doesn't speak to me. It's that I don't want a relationship with him. These were things that I put distance on because they were destructive. And the destructive nature of them was caused by very simply, the people of Praise's level of involvement in people's personal lives where it didn't belong and wasn't justified. The remorse I feel now with like clear eyes it's not like grief. It's more like curiosity. Like, I wonder what would have happened to my 15-year-old self if like some things had gone a different direction. Because I was very brainwashed by them. When I went to public school, we would have to write like topic papers, and I would always write about how abortion was wrong, and here's a strategy for outlawing abortion. Not because I rationally thought that, but because I'd been brainwashed. It'd been put into my head, and I was just parroting their ideas. And I think about myself like, when I was 15, I was happy and I was blissful, but I was also indoctrinated. And you kind of come to the realization: would you trade, knowledge of self and living rationally, and would you trade, being a responsible citizen in exchange for living a life of blissful ignorance where you didn't have to think critically about your actions, but you may have done terrible things inadvertently. Um, to me, like it's one of curiosity. Like it's just something I bat around in my head, but I could never go back. I would never choose to live in ignorance again, the way that these people operate. I would never choose to not take responsibility for terrible ideas I put forth in the world. Um, they honestly believe that they're doing good things, that they're good people. They think in very binary terms, and internally they would describe me as a bad person, and that they are good, and that everyone is good who's in people of praise, and they're inherently good, and you should think that they're good. And it's what they use when they try and justify things like this and try and act like they're a benign faith group in the media. But it's a lie, and it's a lie conducted by liars. That lie is pushed by the people of praise through their PR department. They have a PR department. It's run by a guy named Sean Conley. He and I were friends when we were growing up, and like the reality is that he tells lies through omission and manipulation, and those lies can have elements of truth in them, but they're still lies nonetheless. And it gets back to mendacity. People who are telling you the truth don't need a PR department. But the fundamental lesson that I learned from experiencing those traumatic things um, was something that takes me a second to elaborate. Like the trauma I experienced, filled me with sadness, and then it filled me with anger, and I guess you could attribute that to different stages of grief. But the anger was intense and all-consuming, and I was later traveling through Africa with a friend, and we were talking about that, and he said something really profound to me. He said, if you hate something enough, you become exactly like it. I think at the time I realized like how true that was, but even now more so as like a fully realized adult, like hatred like blinds you to hatred blinds you to things about yourself that you don't like. Um, I resented people of praise's leaders and adults' actions towards me, but I also hated a part of myself, and they had put that hate inside me, that self-hatred, um, through shunning, through ostracization, but also through like the false ideas they put into my head. Um, I think, at least for me, I won't speak for anyone else, but it was really important to get that kind of hatred out of your head and look at things clearly, to even like draw things out so that you can see yourself not just from your own mind's eye, but also in perspective and how other people see you and how you others see other people. One of the things that I feel like I really grew up without in the cult was a perspective and empathy, and cultivating that sense of empathy for other people was what really helped me overcome all of the brainwashing and indoctrination that I experienced.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Pete. I believe in strength in taking, I believe in strength through conversation and identifying experiences through language and terminology. I know that's why people find reading certain books, like Recovering from Cults, really integral to their understanding of experiences, but also to their recovery from those experiences as well. And you mentioned that you are working with a group of people who are also former members, who are also second or multi-generational adults that have moved away from the People of Praise group, each who have experienced their own difficult things within the group. And with this community, do you feel it's helped your recovery? And do you recommend people listening to seek out their own positive community of former members where they can talk openly about their experiences with people who may be able to identify with those things?
Well, I think you hit on a funny thing, and the idea of going from one community to the next, right?
Yeah. That's why I said positive
Well,
community.
I know, but this idea of, jumping from one to the next, I think, is a dangerous idea. I think we see it a lot in addicts where they might jump from, like, let's say, a community of drinkers at a bar to a community of teetotalers through AA. You're exchanging one for the other. You're not really making a lot of change. I feel like the change that, or the benefits that we experience in our group are not ones that we get from the group itself, but from one-on-one communications we can establish with each other, from a trusted pool of potential one-on-one relationships, right? um, I think that's the benefit of the group, is not necessarily a group discussion, but like having a trusted group of people from which to select individuals that you could have a meaningful relationship.
And if people were interested in checking out some of your journalism, is there a place that they'd be able to find any of that online?
I mean, nothing that would pertain to this, but I'm hopeful in a year we'll have something substantive to spread the word.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Pete. You've given us a really clinical overview, history, and analysis of the People of Praise throughout its years and where it is today. The potential issues going forward that the People of Praise pose on everybody in the country and maybe even the world, given the status and influence that the states can often have in other countries and other parts of the world. So I feel like if somebody else was to come on the show now and talk to us about their experiences, we'd be able to identify within the timeline, within the period of the People of Praise, the experiences that the individual was having. And you've been very vulnerable and open with us today as listeners in giving us some insight into your personal experiences. And I am truly thankful to be able to have that conversation with you today, Pete. So I truly appreciate that as well. And going forward, it sounds like there could be some really exciting things happening in the next year or so in terms of people taking back power from people that took power from them. And that is the thing that excites me the most about this podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Casey. I appreciate it.
So I will let you go and enjoy the rest of your day. I'll make sure I get those links from you for the 2 books and the 2 clips, and we will make sure that we edit those into the episode. I think everybody listening will want to really experience those things. So thank you for that as well, Pete. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll speak to you soon.
Sure. Email anytime.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.